So, welcome to another Q&A. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who submitted questions. And once again, there was a great response. So many apologies to everyone who put forward a question that I didn't get round to answering. And if you'd like to pose a question in future, I try to post these videos at the end of every month. Keep an eye on my community tab for the calls for questions. And with that, let's get on with this month's selection. So, Virginia Taliaferro 76, a channel member, asks, are we headed towards a clash of civilizations? Virginia, thank you so much for this, because this touches on something that I've talked about in other videos, about how when I first got really interested in international relations, it was the start of the 1990s. We were at the end of the Cold War. It was a new era. And there were two main books that really shaped the way that we started to think about international relations at that time. One was by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History, and the other one was by somebody called Samuel Huntington, who wrote this book, Clash of Civilizations. In fact, it actually originated as an article that he then made into a book. And I've spoken about The End of History in other videos, and essentially the end of history argument was that liberal democracy had won. That was it. We were now going to move into an era where slowly but surely liberal democracy would become the dominant form of governance around the world. And it might take time, but essentially it had proven itself and that this was the obvious natural way forward. And then Huntington came along and presented a very different view of the world, and saying that yes, it had changed with the end of the Cold War, but it wasn't going to be the end of conflict. It was going to be an era where we started to move in a very different direction. And he outlined what he said would be a future world where instead of conflicts between countries, that it was more likely to be conflicts between civilizations. And he outlined a number of these civilizations, 7, 8, 9, depending on how you approach it. And so, for example, he said that you had a Western civilization. He then said you had a Latin American civilization, Islamic civilization. He talked about an Orthodox Christian civilization, a Hindu civilizational sphere, a Buddhist, Chinese, Japanese. And this became really influential, and it sort of chimed in at a time when we were also seeing a real rise in Islamism, political Islam. And so a lot of people then bought into this idea that, yes, this absolutely was going to be the way it was going to go. I mean, we were already seeing the trends of it. We were seeing how, this rise in greater political Islam was clashing with the West. So, of course, this was likely to be how things were going to develop. I mean, it was quite interesting because at the time, Russia was in a rather different place with regard to the West. I mean, under Boris Yeltsin, it was moving closer towards the West. And so there was a sort of sense of, well, yes, we could potentially see that, but maybe that's based on outdated thinking, and that maybe Russia is moving closer. And then, of course, we saw greater tensions emerging between Russia and the West. And so I think there was a sense that, yeah, this was actually quite prescient, that this argument actually held water. I don't think it's played out like that at all. I think that it's what we've actually seen is a far more interesting and complex picture. And your question got me into thinking that in actual fact, we are seeing clashes, but it seems interesting that in fact, maybe we're moving into a world where it's an odd combination of, if you take the end of history argument about liberal democracy having won, and then the clash of civilizations argument, and sort of start bringing them together, that you can actually see that what I think that we're actually seeing is that it's almost like there is a battle for liberal democracy, or something akin to a more open form of governance, taking place within these civilizational areas, which I think, and it doesn't cross all of those civilizational areas, I have to stress. But I think it's really fascinating if you start to sort of maybe think of it in these terms, that it isn't the battle between Islam and the West, it's the battle between those regimes, those states in the Muslim world which want to adopt a very narrow, very regressive form of the religion, and then others who are willing to sort of look at a more open, engaged form, still retaining the faith. But the battles that we're seeing there, and that, of course, is now playing out in the West, of course, because we're seeing the rise of the far right, and this is posing a fundamental challenge again within one of those civilizational spheres. And we were sort of thinking of it on the edges. A few countries, sort of, Hungary, Poland at one point, although it has stepped back from that. But of course, we've got a huge question now with the United States, and so I think it's becoming really interesting that if you start to think of all of this. Oh, and of course, another very important area that he'd identified was sub-Saharan Africa. That what you can actually see in many of these areas, be it Latin America, be it the West, be it sub-Saharan Africa, the Islamic world, is a battle between those forces which, as I say, are maybe more open, not necessarily completely democratic, but certainly more open, willing to liberalise to a greater or lesser extent, and those forces which are taking those civilizational spheres within a more sort of regressive, potentially repressive area. And look, I have to say that, I'm very cautious about this civilizational argument in some ways. But if you want to look at it in that, in those sort of ways, I think that actually becomes a really interesting way. And of course, we can see this particularly clearly in the Orthodox Christian sphere. So instead of Huntington saying, well, these countries were all going to sort of work with each other and it's a civilizational sphere and it would come into conflict with the West, what we're seeing is exactly, is the opposite of that. We are seeing then, according to this sort of Huntington thesis, effectively a civil war taking place within the Orthodox world. And that, on the one hand, you've got you've got Russia versus Ukraine, and you've got Ukraine, which is moving in a direction towards Western Europe or towards the rest of the European Union. Yet, it's liberal, it's democratic, and then you've got a much more authoritarian, much more repressive Russia, which is taking a very different position. And that you can see that, so Moldova would fall within that. There is a battleground taking place. Moldova is a very, very divided society. You've got a significant proportion which is very pro-Western. You've got a significant proportion of the country which is pro-Russian. And you can paint that in several of the other countries which fall within it. Serbia is a very interesting example of this. Bulgaria is also an interesting example of this. So I think that actually it's really, really fascinating that if you take this lens of these two major books from the 1990s, which, it probably doesn't resonate a lot with, maybe even IR students who were coming through post-2000, and certainly those of the last 15 years, they might be aware of these books. But certainly for IR scholars of my generation, these were hugely significant, not necessarily because you agreed with one or both of them or disagreed, but simply because it very much framed our sense of thinking about the world, and we carry that forward. And so when you asked about this clash of civilizations, it really did get me thinking a little bit more about this and how it's played out. And it suddenly seemed, as I say, that in fact, as I say, what we're seeing is, I think, to a degree, you might be able to talk of these civilizational spheres, but they haven't coalesced into single groups that are fighting each other. What instead you're seeing, if you take this Fukuyama's end of history argument, is battles within those civilizational spheres about the direction they should be taking. So I think it's a really, really great question that you asked, and thank you so much for that. So Dada Baba asks, why did the West fail to integrate Russia into the bloc like it did with a majority of the ex-USSR countries? Thank you for this. I think I'd probably start by pushing back a little and saying that I think there is a sense that, somehow Russia was kept out and the other countries were sort of integrated. But of course, when you take a deeper look at it, in fact, there's remarkably few of the 15 Soviet republics that were integrated into the West. The three standout, of course, are the three Baltic states, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But we have to remember that when they became independent, they were always treated very differently from the other Soviet republics. They had been invaded, they'd been occupied by the Soviet Union during the Second World War. And technically, most Western states had never formally recognized them as being part of the Soviet Union. They effectively said these are occupied Soviet republics. They're not, they're not like the other Soviet republics. And so when they became independent, they were very, very quickly, and I have to say relatively easily, integrated within Europe. And then we obviously saw them join NATO. Now, it wasn't necessarily an entirely easy process. They have Russian populations, and that has caused significant issues in different ways. But essentially, they were brought in. But if you look at the other republics of the Soviet Union, we haven't really seen that process. So Moldova has been a really strange one. It's had times when it's been particularly pro-Western and wanted and looked towards European Union. It's militarily neutral, so it's never sort of thought of joining NATO. But then it swings back and it has a government that is much more harkens back to the Soviet Union, and so is much more pro-Russia. Ukraine was equally the same. It's only relatively recently that it now has a very defined sort of pro-Europe, pro-Western outlook. But for a long time, it was switching between the West and Russia, and something that's often brought up in the channel by, sort of commentators saying, although, the West has sort of done all it can and it's staged coups in Ukraine, forgetting, of course, that this is a territory that Russia has also fought a political campaign to swing it over to its side. So the West and Russia were both doing that. The big difference, of course, is that Russia eventually decided that it was going to invade to achieve its goals. Belarus has been fascinating as well. It's firmly within the Russia camp these days. But there were times when it looked like Lukashenko was maybe flirting a bit more with the West and Europe and things. And as I say, it's now flipped back. It's actually got a state union with Russia. They've got a commitment to integrate. Nothing seems to actually be happening on that. But, you just go through and you think, the Caucasus Republic, Georgia, again, it's had elements of pro-Russia, pro-West. It looked like it was finally moving very much in the European Union direction. And now it's swinging back more towards a pro-Russian position, even though Russia occupies part of the country. Azerbaijan, likewise, it's had a very strange relationship with Europe, because I think in some ways it might be more tempted to sort of look towards that direction. But it's had lots of questions about democracy, human rights, which have caused problems. Armenia has remained in a military alliance, although that is breaking down with Russia at the moment. So really, look, I could go on. I can talk about the Central Asian republics and things. And by the way, there was a fantastic interview I recently did with someone called Michael Hilliard on the Central Asian republics. I'll put a link up above for anyone who might be interested. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think there's a sense in certain quarters that the West has gone all out to try and take all the territories around Russia that were formerly part of the Soviet Union and integrate them and leave Russia out to its one side. And this is an argument that many who support the Russian invasion of Ukraine have sort of come up with, because they're also saying, well, it's also the big bad West coming in and taking these countries, and this is a fundamental security threat to Russia. But when you actually break down that process, you can see that actually wasn't the case. As I say, when you move beyond the Baltic states, there's actually been a real battle going on between Moscow and the West to try and shape the views of these countries. And I have to say that, I work a lot on sort of EU enlargement. I work a lot, on Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe in particular. And one thing I can say with absolute certainty is I've never met a single official from any of these countries who said they have felt pressured to join the European Union or NATO. It's very much a question they want to, but the attitude has been of NATO and of the European Union, take it or leave it. And by the way, if you want to take it, you've got to jump through the hoops in order to do it, especially with the European Union. So I think I would push back on your basic point to say that why has the West failed to integrate Russia into the bloc like it did with the majority of the ex-USSR countries, because I don't think it actually has integrated most of the former Soviet countries. Caviar Vision asks, is it possible to see a new unipolar world order similar to the United States position after the fall of the Soviet Union within a reasonable time? This is a great question because, of course, we're seeing what's happening with the United States now. And I think, just to maybe put this in a little bit of perspective, and if you like, this is the theme that's coming out in this month's Q&A, is this argument of what was happening in the 1990s and how it's played forward to where we see the world today. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we get to the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapses, and the United States becomes the hyperpower. It's not just the superpower alongside the Soviet Union anymore. It's in this, we're talking about a unipolar world where it's dominated by the United States. But it didn't last nearly as long as many might suspect. I think we already start to see very early on, I mean, for example, US intervention in Somalia, which I've spoken about on occasion, did not go well. And we started to see a realization within the United States that even though it was this hyperpower, that it was constrained, that it wasn't able to sort of do what it wanted all around the world. And I think obviously the high point of that sort of sense of hubris that it could do what it wanted was the invasion of Iraq. And then it all started to come tumbling down, that Iraq did not work out well. We saw what happened with Afghanistan. So essentially, we had maybe a decade and a half where it looked like the United States was in this unassailable position. And now that has collapsed. And we are looking at, well, certainly a multipolar world of one sort or another, but not necessarily all different poles having equal strength, but, and in different ways. So United States still the preeminent military force. But of course, we're seeing China sort of rapidly developing. And if you look at the sort of defense expenditure, the United States still absolutely head and shoulders above any country in terms of its defense spending. China is number two, but, until it might have changed in the past year or so. But until very recently, the United States was spending more on defense than it was than the next 9 or 10 countries combined. It was that much higher. But of course, you've seen China develop as an economic power, that we're seeing sort of India flexing its muscles more and more and sort of projecting its own wish on the world. We're seeing countries coming together. Russia obviously wants to see itself in a position. We're talking about the BRICS as a contrast to the West, but within the West, that's breaking down is the European Union. So we're in a really, really confusing world. But I think it's very difficult at this stage to say it looks like we'll see some sort of unipolar world developing again, because then you have to have that superpower or that hyperpower take over, and it's very difficult to see what that would be. Some again talk about China, but I'm not sure that it has those capabilities in the round. It might well be, but if you want to be that hyperpower, in the case of the United States, it wasn't just simply because it had the military power. It also had, I guess you could talk about a power of attraction. There were a lot of countries that looked to the United States as a leader. There were shared values. And this is one of the things which, I have again spoken about in other videos, where, for example, Donald Trump has thrown away a lot of that and those around him, because they haven't actually really understood that the United States' power didn't just come from its sort of economic position. It didn't just come from its military position. It came from its leadership. And it came from the fact that a lot of countries looked to the United States for that leadership. And that's now being questioned. And I think if you put that in context of what if we're talking about a unipolar world, are there countries that would look, for example, to China in that way? Does China have an ideology? Does China have a leadership position that would naturally bring countries to its side as allies, as countries that would look to it as leadership, that would take their direction from Beijing, not simply because Beijing orders them to do so, but simply because they see themselves as part of a club where Beijing is the preeminent power, and they want to be associated with that on a voluntary basis. So I think that that's the real question that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about, the emergence of a new unipolar world. There might be a coercive power that can do that, but it would seem very difficult to see how that would emerge. And in that sense, then what would replace the United States and the role that the United States has or had? It would very much talk about that sort of power of attraction, and that wanting to work with it. The European Union, I think, is interesting. I don't think that it is moving in that direction. I think there's divisions within itself. But again, I'm not sure that it has that sort of outreach in the same way that the United States once had. There has been talk in the past about, normative power Europe, and that it's about international law. And I still think the European Union really could do a lot more on the world stage and find those allies, especially within the West, and sort of saying, look, can it not necessarily replace the United States, but serve as a center, a central gathering point for countries like Canada, for Australia, for New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. I think that would be a really, really interesting direction to go. But I don't see it at the moment. So no, I guess after a very long answer, I don't see an emergence of a unipolar world in any reasonable time. Might happen in the future, but I think that the circumstances, the context, are all very different and make it very unlikely at the moment. Me Entertainment Joe asks, if more countries begin to pursue nuclear weapons, what do you think the reaction from established larger countries like the United States or China will be? I think we could very well be moving into a world where this isn't so much a theoretical question, but it becomes a very real practical question. So look, we know that there were the 5 declared nuclear powers, and those are the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So United States, Soviet Union, which obviously then became Russia. You had Britain, France, and China. We know that there are a number of countries which have gone on to develop nuclear weapons. So we have India, Pakistan, we have North Korea. There have been countries that had nuclear weapons programs, and Israel, of course, undeclared, but it's sort of probably one of the worst kept secrets in international relations. We had countries that had nuclear weapons that gave them up. So Ukraine, although everyone, it always sparks an argument, did it have nuclear weapons, or were they sort of effectively Russian nuclear weapons, which it gave back to Russia? Be that as it may, there were weapons in Ukraine which it gave up. South Africa also, when it got to the end of the apartheid era, it had a nuclear program which it gave up. And then, of course, we know that there are other countries which have been looking into developing nuclear weapons. Iran is the most obvious example, and what we've seen. But one of the things which really, really worries me about what we're seeing with the war in Ukraine at the moment is a sense that if the old order of international relations is breaking down, and that the principle of territorial integrity of states is no longer as strong as it once was, and more countries feel that they have a right to invade their neighbour and try to seize territory, then I think we could be getting into a world where countries start to speak more openly about obtaining nuclear weapons. And that will create these sort of problems of how will other countries like the United States, like China, react to it. I think in the immediate future, there is still that sense of opprobrium about developing nuclear weapons. There's a prohibition, a taboo, if you like, on trying to gain nuclear weapons. But I think this will start to break down, and I think we're already starting to see debates about it. So, for example, in Europe, there's been discussions. At the moment, it's obviously Britain and France are the nuclear powers, but should they be extending this out to be a European nuclear umbrella? Countries like Poland sort of almost looking into the air and saying, I wonder if maybe we should be thinking about it as well. We have Russia on our doorstep. And so I can definitely see that more countries will start to move in this direction. But of course, if it's just one or two, then you can perhaps introduce sanctions on them and say, listen, please don't do this. This violates international law. But if more and more start to push in that direction, then how do you respond to it? And how will that be seen by the main nuclear powers at the moment? How will China respond? If other countries close by start to, if they were to develop nuclear technology. Now, I don't think it's going to happen for, many reasons, but Japan, for example, or South Korea. And the implications of all of that. So I think it's a really, really fascinating question, because I think we are moving into an era where we might start to see more countries developing nuclear weapons. And what will the response of that be? And at the moment, I think it's a response that's based on international law, and the sense that you should not be developing nuclear weapons because this is bad, and international law says that you shouldn't through various treaties. But we could be getting into and we are obviously seeing a bit with that in Iran, or a lot with Iran, of then big countries saying, we see you as a threat, and you developing nuclear weapons, doesn't matter about the treaties. This is a threat to us. We will react to it. And I think that then becomes, it's becoming a worrying situation already with Iran. But I think if more and more countries are doing this, and that process accelerates, then I think, we are moving into a very, very dangerous world. And we will start to see countries then, sort of bigger countries, start to make strategic calculations that if a neighbouring country is developing nuclear weapons, does it develop nuclear weapons if it doesn't already have them? Or if it does have them, does it take military action to strike against that and then say, well, you can't attack us back because we've got nuclear weapons? So it's a very, very important and very worrying question. Mohammed Ahmad asks, if China decides to forcibly take Taiwan today, on what legal basis can Western countries oppose such action, since they recognise Taiwan as legally part of China? Mohammed, thank you for this, because you raise a really, really important and interesting question. And of course, there is a lot of concern about what's going to happen to Taiwan, that we're seeing all sorts of signs that maybe China is gearing up for some effort to take control of Taiwan. Now, we've often thought of that as some sort of invasion, but there is another scenario, which I actually covered in another video, which is this idea of a siege, that effectively China could just suddenly one day say, right, okay, Taiwan, that's it. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. You are going to be part of China. We're not going to invade you, but we will just make sure that you're placed under siege, and at some point you will give in. And, whether then they just sort of say, right, okay, that's it, and that's when they send in the troops, or negotiations start and China says, right, okay, fine, we'll give you a special status in China, but enough of this, you're not part of China, or, well, you are part of China, but you're an alternative government, and says to Taiwan, time to stop that. So this is an issue that becomes really, really interesting. And either scenario of either an invasion or a siege raises several different important aspects. So there is this response of the international community, and you rightly sort of highlight that there's an interesting legal position. But I think we also need to think of it very much in a political sense as well, and the two are tied together. So from a legal perspective, you're absolutely right. I mean, the international community's position is a one country, two systems position, that Taiwan is part of China the People's Republic of China. In fact, Taiwan officially says that it's part of China. It just so happens that in being part of China, it's the legitimate government of China, whereas, of course, Beijing says, well, no, there is only one China, and the People's Republic is that China. So it's a really interesting position in international relations. But I think that the emphasis is on this idea of one country, two systems, that integrating Taiwan into China the Western position has always been this should be done as part of a negotiated consensual process, and that there should be no place for use of force. But of course, what we've been seeing in recent years is that there has been this idea that countries are now moving more and more towards force in order to try and deal with these issues. So let's leave aside Russia-Ukraine, because obviously, Russia would say, well, Crimea was part of our territory and we're just taking it back. And we always felt that Eastern Ukraine, in fact, we felt that all of Ukraine, that doesn't hold up legally. But I think there is another case which was very interesting, which got relatively little international attention when it happened. And of course, this was Azerbaijan's decision to retake Nagorno-Karabakh, which had been sort of under Armenian control for a very long time. And essentially, when Azerbaijan took it back, the position had been, again, for a long time, UN resolutions, that there'd been a peace process, that this should be done peacefully, it should be done consensually, and that's not what happened. Azerbaijan decided to retake it by military force, and effectively the world just shrugged its shoulders and said, right, okay, you've done it, we'll just accept it. And I wonder, if policymakers in Beijing will have been thinking the same. Now, of course, taking Taiwan is regarded very differently. Taiwan has a very interesting and complex relationship with the United States. And so there is that question of, would the United States come to its defense? I think you have a lot of other countries that, even though they don't recognize Taiwan as the legitimate government of China anymore, let alone as an independent state, but they do have very close relations with it. Taiwan, there's diplomatic offices from many, many Western countries in Taipei. And so the question is, what would be the international response? So even though the international community would say, well, from a legal point of view, China has every right to exert its control over Taiwan, but from a political point of view, it's always been accepted that that should be a political process. If China were to then act militarily, what would the response be? Now, it's at this point that you get into a really interesting debate about something called remedial secession. And this is something that I've been interested in for a very, very long time. And this is the principle that if a territory faces a fundamental existential threat to its existence, that it can declare independence and be recognized as a form of self-defense. Because once you recognize a territory as sovereign, you can then say, right, okay, we will provide you with arms, we will provide you with other support, diplomatic support. Whether, if there was any hint that China was going to act, that Taiwan would say, right, okay, we're now going to declare independence. And then what the response of the international community would be, or large parts of it, Europe, United States, I think becomes a really interesting question, because if they then recognize it, it's a little bit as the debate we're seeing over Palestine at the moment. What do they then do to support that? Or is this just a nice statement of support for Taiwan, which is a last flicker of support before it's effectively extinguished by China? Or would they then act in some way to say, right, okay, we're going to recognize Taiwan as an independent state. China, if you do anything further on this, we will act, and probably not militarily. It might happen that the United States might do that, and that's the big question and debate that many in the United States have been having, whether the United States could or should do that. But also countries like, in Europe, which could very well say, right, okay, we believe that we need to impose sanctions on China, and quite sweeping ones, and all the implications that has. But of course, you've got large parts of the world, and that would really test where they stand in the current international system, especially if the United States were to come out with the European Union and say, look, this is absolutely unacceptable. China, you had to find a peaceful settlement. You failed to do that. We are now imposing sanctions. And then says to the rest of the world, right, we expect you to follow suit. Of course, you're not going to get a UN Security Council resolution because China is a member of the UN Security Council, so would veto it rather than the same way that Russia has vetoed UN Security Council resolutions on Ukraine. So you would open up a really, really interesting argument because you're absolutely right. From a legal point of view, China does have the right, if you like, to do this. But there has always been an understanding that it shouldn't do it. And so if it did try to do it, how would that debate play out? Would we see what effectively took place with Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, where they just simply say, right, okay, it's your territory. We didn't want you to do it militarily, but now that you've done it, it's finished? Or would they take a much stronger position, on doing this? So it's a really, really interesting and important question, and much more complex in many ways than I think either side of the debate would make it out to be. On a final note, Nicholas Soriano asks, what is realistically the minimum population required for a country? Many say Greenland, with 50,000 inhabitants, is too small to be a country, yet Tuvalu has just 10,000. So where's the limit? So, Nicholas, you raise a really interesting point that, when we talk about states and international relations, and I often mention about this, but, we have what we call the Montevideo criteria, so which essentially lays out four things. So, a state should have a defined territory, it should have a settled population, it should have governance, and it should have the capacity to enter into international relations with other states. So, what's really interesting is that there is no defined minimum or defined criteria for any of those. So we don't actually have a formal, benchmark to say you have got to have X number of people in order to be considered a state. And so what you end up with is this really strange international system with countries like China and India with over 1 billion inhabitants as sovereign states sitting at the UN with one seat at the UN. And then right at the other end of the scale, you have Tuvalu, which is the world's smallest country in terms of population with just 10,000 inhabitants. And it's really interesting because you do then start to say, well, at that point, do you start to draw limits on the other criteria, which is governance? So what you need to have is a territory that can govern itself and perform the basic functions of statehood. And I think once you start to get below 10,000, then you really do have to ask yourself, how feasible is this as a sovereign state in the international system, given that membership of the international system now requires sort of being involved in all sorts of different areas and having proper representation and being able to function effectively within that. And I'm reminded of another, there were a couple of other small South Pacific islands or island groups which could potentially become independent. And many, many years ago, one of my earlier videos, I might put a link to it, but forgive the quality, which was absolutely fascinating, was a debate over a small islands, an island group called Tokelau, which is currently under New Zealand's sort of, if you like, colonial control. But there was talk about whether it could become independent, and it has a population of just around 1,000. And you really would have to ask yourself at that point, what would that mean as an independent state with 1,000 inhabitants? That, what would that mean in terms of being able to provide adequate healthcare for a population? What would that mean in terms of, of course you could have a doctor there, but you're not going to have a major hospital or anything like that. You're not going to, and where would the revenues come in for it? What about defence? Well, you could say, well, it would have some sort of association agreement that maybe New Zealand or another country could provide for defence. What about foreign affairs? Even the smallest country really needs to have, at minimum, one international diplomatic mission, and that would be to the United Nations. And sometimes, while we think of countries like China or United States have diplomatic missions all around the world, some of these smaller countries maybe only have 3 embassies. So it might be, there would be a mission to the United Nations and then maybe 2 countries which they consider to be important. So maybe in the South Pacific it would be Australia and the United States, and maybe increasingly Beijing. You've got to have diplomats in order to be able to do that. What about setting up infrastructure, roads, transportation, all of these things. Now, you'd say these are small societies, they don't need a lot, but again, they're operating in a modern world. So how does that work? What would be the minimum? And I think that 10,000 probably is the bare minimum that you could realistically think. And so actually Greenland, with 50,000 inhabitants, it would certainly be one of the smaller countries in the world, but it certainly wouldn't be the smallest. And it probably could be functional and work quite well. In fact, it almost certainly could, for a whole bunch of reasons. It's got a lot of mineral wealth and things. So, you can do what, for example, some of the Gulf state countries have done, where you've got a population and then you have a massive immigrant population which deals with a lot of day-to-day things. But you're dealing with a slightly different situation in the South Pacific, for example, because these aren't territories with a lot of land, and they're territories that are losing land at a rapid pace. So they can't suddenly say, well, look, even if they were found to be sitting on valuable mineral resources in the economic zone around these islands, that they could suddenly say, well, look, there may be 10,000 of us, but we'll just import 100,000 people who will do all that we want done. They just don't have the space to do that. So I think it's a whole combination of things. But it is very interesting that officially, at least, there is no set limit on how much territory a state has to have to be a country, what its population is. We don't have a formally defined sense of what governance is, and the ability to enter into international relations has also been thrown into the air in recent decades, because there are now so many different groups, companies even, that effectively are able to have international relations, that we don't tend to use that in quite the same way. But in terms of, as I say, a population, it isn't set as a minimum limit, but I think that in practical terms, you would probably say that Tuvalu is probably the smallest amount that could feasibly, you could imagine. I hope you found that interesting. And if you'd like to see more from me, here are a couple of recent videos that you may have missed. Thanks so much, and see you in the next one.